We have a speaker today, John Ragonese with Great River Hydro. I work with John. John is the manager for Great River Hydro for most things FERC. Relicensing of the Lower Connecticut projects, Vernon, Bellows Falls, Wilder, and compliance of all of the FERC licenses. So our projects have FERC licenses. He is the manager of compliance with those licenses. He's going to give us an update on the relicensing.
Hi.
Hi. Good. How you doing?
Good. How was the tour? Any questions? Good?
Fascinating.
Fascinating?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, I don't have anything formal. I have been a little bit preoccupied in the last couple of weeks. I have a office in Portsmouth where I live that decided to finally sort of close it and just work out of the house because I don't necessarily need to go to the office so much anymore. But that office contained, as I was telling you, Jen, I just sent 40 boxes of files to get it scanned by a, like a professional scanner. And I had like two more to do. And I was there last night trying to get them done because I have movers coming tomorrow that are basically taking all my old furniture and to the dump, I think is really where they're going with it. But I literally was finding like files that were 1910 engineering assessments of the potential for water power on the Deerfield. So this is like 1905 to 1915. And, I've always been sort of fascinated how well they sort of estimated the hydrology. And I actually, instead of just like putting them in and labeling, I was starting to read some of the stuff. And I can't say I knew that I knew the accuracy of what they were saying was correct, but there was a lot of sort of like, not fudging, but like conservativeness put in it in some of these estimates of flow back in 110 years ago. So it gave me a little bit of an appreciation because I've always been a little bit fascinated how well those projects were designed. Now I would say they're not so well designed, for the dryness we see now in April and June, which we see now as of the last 15 years or so. But other than that, they're pretty spot on, which was to me fascinating. But anyways, I'm reading this stuff. I'm going like, okay, I gotta put this out. I gotta get this stuff out of here. I gotta move it out of here. So I was in there a little late last night. So I wanted to keep it somewhat informal, but I thought, wow, look at me, there I am. This is a little creepy. This is really creepy, actually. No, it's fine.
One thing I didn't mention
Sure.
is how long you've been with the project, if you want to give.
Sure. Well, my background, I went to the University of New Hampshire. My background is actually forest management and business. But I did my last couple of years in college. I did a lot of operations modeling. I was doing things like I had this really interesting professor, and he really took we took a mutual liking to each other, and he was really interested in some stuff. And literally, when we're talking about modeling back then, I literally had like the IBM paper cards where you'd punch every command in, it would move on, and you'd have a stack of cards like this to run a Fortran program. But I was really interested in this is a little background, so it's a little longer story than maybe Jen was hoping I would get. But I was really interested in optimizing the use of forest products from the woods all the way to the coming out the end of the mill. And so I was doing things like, well, if you change the width of a saw from a circular saw, which had like a 1/4 or 5/16 kerf, to a bandsaw, and then a bandsaw that cut both ways, how can you improve the efficiencies? Less trucks on the road, all this kind of stuff. So, which was really cool. I mean, it was great stuff. It was really fun. But my first few years of work was out west, in Northwest, northern Idaho. I was a surveyor. I was putting roads in for the Forest Service in literally virgin timber. I mean, we had cedar trees as wide as this table, not this way, but this way. But unfortunately, everything that wasn't like a 2x12 that was 32 feet long would go into a teepee burner, and it just bugged the living daylight. I mean, this is 70s, so or 80s, I guess. But it was everything that wasn't perfect because they didn't care. It was like everything. I got another square mile of land I can cut. And I worked for Burlington Northern Railroad, again, big resource company back then. They don't own the, I think Plum Creek Timber or something like that. It was a spinoff. But in any event, I ended up coming back here. Was a private consultant for a number of years, and then I realized it's really hard to make a living being a private consultant in southern New Hampshire because everybody's land was the highest and best use was basically a subdivision in their view. So I didn't see a long-term future in my little business, although there's a consultant that still is managing some of those properties I used to manage right now. But I literally, I come home one day, my wife has my entire desk cleared, except for this little ad that was in the Boston Globe for New England Power Company. I was looking for a forester. And I was back in '83, and I ended up getting that job, long story short, and I managed the lands. I managed all of the transmission right-of-ways in New Hampshire, Vermont, Western Mass, and then we had a utility. It was a utility back then, so we had a distribution company called Granite State Electric, which was over here in Lebanon. And you know, we had, I don't know, I guess I had about 700 miles of like street lines that you trim the trees on. So I did all those three things for a while, and eventually they asked me if I wanted to go down to work in Westboro, and I said, no, thank you. I'd rather stay with hydros. And so I've sort of been with the hydros ever since that time, not just managing the lands, but eventually doing the permitting, which was my first relicensing was on the Deerfield, and then it was 15 Falls, and now here. So I have basically 40 years now, almost 40 years of experience, which, truth be told, I had to take off my no nuke sticker on the back of my pickup when I came up for my interview up here, because I knew they owned 20% of Seabrook at the time. So it's not like I sold my soul. I've always felt like it's better to make change from within, and I've felt that way till today. You know, I think that even our relicensing that I've been doing right now, these projects in the river is going to be better as a result of some of my work, and definitely some of Jen's work as well, to bring them up to more modern expectations. What I look at. So my first boss used to look at the bypasses on the Deerfield that I was trying to figure out whether or not we put white water in, or we put minimum flows in, and he would go, but they're emergency spillways. I said, yeah. That's what you think of them as, because that's what they were for the last 50 years. But the millennium or two before that, they were actually rivers, and that really is sort of the mindset. You work in a plant, you're very proud of what you do, but you don't necessarily see from the outside. And when I came from the environmental side of the house, you have to recognize that. You have to be able to listen to people and understand, but at the same time, try to teach them. And I think one of the elements of our proposed operation is really a collaboration of stakeholders listening to what our world is, and me listening and understanding what their desires are. And so I'll start off by just talking about relicensing and what our proposal is going forward, which is a major part of it. I'll talk on our fish passage agreement that we signed. I'll talk about a little bit about the process and the timetable where we are right now, and sort of what's still ahead of us regarding like our 401 certifications. We have some endangered species consultation that'll have to be done. There's a little bit more work on, or a bit more work, but not really work, but just process on cultural resource and historic resource management, and then just other elements that may be in the proposal regarding you say recreation or these cultural resource issues. But I really would like you to just interrupt me if you have any particular question you might want to have. Let me start with the process and the timetable. It's never as short as people would like. you know, in 40 years, I've only gotten 3 of these done. So it gives you sort of like there's your sort of framework. But we've largely, the process that we undertook essentially has 2 phases. One is a whole phase that the applicant does where they're studying things, they're scoping out issues with the stakeholders, they're coming up with studies, they're reporting on the studies, and eventually you put in an application. And we're at the point where we have put in an application, we've amended that application, and then, but we're not formally at the stage where FERC is taking our application and reviewing it or doing its environmental analysis. They're largely waiting to do that for the process to catch up with where we are downstream at the First Light project, which are Turner's Falls and their pump storage project. They've done the same thing. They've amended their applications and they've filed an application, but they're also in the midst of some settlement discussions, and they've asked FERC to hold off beginning their environmental analysis until they can get those settlement discussions hopefully finalized and executed into an agreement. So that's really sort of where we are now. What FERC tends to do is they'll often do an environmental assessment, which is a little bit more simplified process-wise. But in this case, they're going to do an environmental impact statement on all 5 projects as a collective sort of cumulative impact and sequential kind of analysis of the environmental. We think that our proposal that we put forth in our operation really will largely carry downstream, but we are not involved with those negotiations that they're having about their operations downstream. We know we've probably affected it. We would say in a positive way, and we would say from a stakeholder perspective from a positive way, but we're not involved with trying to get them to do anything or suggest anything. Our 2 agreements largely deal with the major issues associated with what people in our studies were about, which are impacts on fish and operations. And then we did do some major studies on erosion as well, and we have studies on endangered species, and we had studies on recreation and all that kind of stuff. But largely these agreements that we've agreed to, or the MOA and the settlement agreement, are on fish passage and on the operations. And that carries a lot of benefit to all of those resources that I've largely talked about. I guess my first question is, are folks familiar with what we propose for operations? Or I don't know how much detail you would be interested in learning or what. It's going to be significantly different.
I would say give a summary.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
If you could summarize it, that would be really helpful.
All right. So generally speaking, right now, under our current license, we have an operating bandwidth that we have in our license, and that will continue going forward. The operating range of our units in terms of what its lowest capability are and highest, and the operating range in the impoundment will be identical in terms of its overall range. But what will change is, instead of so let me step back. In the current license, even though we might have had this range or this, it was often driven by essentially what the ISO wholesale market provides us for opportunity to peak and not peak. Largely what the water that's available to us drives. If in the past August, where we've had nothing but minimum flows, we don't do anything but pass minimum flow. That's all we do. If there is water, we try to put it in the best hours. But generally speaking, when it's really low flow, we just are passing conservation flow. And then in terms of the operating band of the impoundment, we often exercise that full, say in the case of Wilder, 5 feet. In the case of Bellows, it's 3 feet. In the case of Vernon, generally it's about 2.5 feet. We really only exercise that under high flow conditions. What we really ideally would like to do is keep it as high as we can, because that creates the greatest head And so our bandwidth, our normal operating bandwidth, for example, at Wilder, even though we have 5 feet, is really the upper 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet. Going forward, it will largely be similar in terms of that normal bandwidth, but going forward at all 3 of these projects, we're 90% or 95% of the time, it will be inflow equals outflow. These are going to be largely theoretically, or not theoretically, but at the dam, they're going to be run-of-river projects. But unlike a small project that has, I don't know, let's just maybe, like say on the Lamoille River or something like that, where it's a very small impoundment, it's very easy to sort of like measure your inflow and pass your inflow. This is 46 miles long. And so the inflow, is it inflow at the upper end or is it the inflow at the, and the only way we could really structure that was its inflow at the dam. There's too much variability and time interval to this. So largely the impoundment is going to stay fairly stable at the dam. And the way we're going to do that is essentially predict inflow at the dam. Not predict inflow everywhere, but we're going to have tools that will help us predict in advance what the inflow will be at the dam on an hour-to-hour basis. That's our goal. So that we can schedule the generation to be essentially passing that inflow. Now, we'll largely have a target elevation that we aim for. It'll be about 1/2 foot below the top of our pond. That's where all of these projects will generally speaking, will operate 90–95% of the time. In the case of June, 99% of the time. In the case of May, 99% of the time. But if we don't get the prediction of the inflow correct, we have a little bit of a bandwidth above and below this target to account for that. Because we schedule on an hour-to-hour basis. If the inflow is less than what we are generating and predicted, the pond will go down a little bit. It's not going to go down a lot, but it'll go down a little bit. If it's 4 hours of that consistent thing, it'll still go down a little bit, but not a lot. But that bandwidth gives us the opportunity to do that and not constantly move the generators up and down. We might be 0.2 lower than that target by the end of a day. So we'll take into account what we predict the inflow to be the next day and maybe generate a little bit less to bring it back up to the target. But that's our goal.
Now, when you say 0.2, you're talking about 0.2 of an inch?
Of a foot.
Of a foot. Okay.
Yeah. So we're talking about, 2 inches or 2.5 inches or something. That's generally what we're striving to do. Now, there are 2 sort of like caveats to that inflow equals outflow. One is if the ISO requires us to generate. These are largely, these are fast start resources. We want to keep them fast start resources. You need fast start resources to bring in more and more variable renewables like solar and wind. You need some fast start resources that don't require you to basically have a gas turbine running all the time that you can. So we have a sort of an emergency clause. If there's emergency or ISO-driven requirements for us to operate, we will just follow what those dispatch requirements are. Now, is that a lot? We've been dispatched. I think we figured it maybe it's probably less than 100, probably more like 20 times in a year. We get dispatched by the ISO. Sometimes it's for 2 minutes. Sometimes it's for 10 minutes. They're not long events typically, but we have to respond. We're critical resources for the ISO for that function. We want to maintain. So they're not going to happen a lot. And oftentimes, if they want us to be, if they need us, oftentimes they say, we want you to be ready, but they never dispatch us. We're like the last best option for them because we're the fastest response. We have other resources we might call upon. So oftentimes we're held in like this emergency condition, but they don't actually even dispatch us. We're like the last straw that they can call upon. And that is essentially in the case of, say, before you're gonna like start shedding load, they will hold us in reserve until the last bit of energy is needed to keep something before you shed load. That's what hydro is.
How quick is your
Response,
response? Yeah.
minute, 2 minutes.
John, you want to be able to predict the flow at the dam. Why not take the actual flows at the dam to determine whether or not you're going to generate electricity?
Because of the market we're in,
Because of ISO?
it's the wholesale market is a day ahead market. And we will do that if we need to. I mean, we can redeclare and we can redispatch, but our primary market is a day ahead market. We are required to bid in advance for the next day what we're going to do. And we'd like to continue to do that. Now, if we're totally off, or let's just say there wasn't an anticipated thunderstorm and the flows come up, we're not going to exceed something. We have to change our schedule. But rather than do that on the fly, because in some cases it could penalize us. We've made all kinds of arrangements around New England for load to be here and here and here. And if suddenly you're telling us you have to come on, we've got to pull somebody off somewhere else. Potentially. This is all somewhat not hypothetical, but just in a theoretical sense, they have to take load off the unit. It's kind of like, I often equate it with your body. You have to maintain a certain amount of blood pressure. Cut yourself, you're going to bleed out. You got to stop that. And at the same time, you don't want too much blood pressure because you'll explode. The electrical system is the exact same way. In terms of energy, in terms of voltage, in terms of reactive power, all of these parts that are in the system, we're the emergency feature. We're the ones that can bring up. In some cases, we can spin a unit and pull energy off in an emergency to keep the voltage from frying everybody's refrigerator. And that's what is what a mechanical turbine generator can do with the water. It can literally absorb or generate. And that's what we do. It's not a lot per se in terms of like our function, but it happens. We are operating sometimes based on what the system needs for stability purposes.
Has that changed over the years with more solar and
More.
a little bit of
It is more.
wind?
It's
And now with battery backup coming on more, is that
It's
changing?
coming on, but it's not there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it isn't there. And as technology improves, I think batteries will become a component of that reactive kind of role that the system needs, but they can't absorb necessarily. That's where they don't charge as quickly as, but it's coming. It's technology is really what's driving it, and economics. I mean, it would have, to do what this station here, you would have just nothing but container size battery banks is all out there to do what this does right here. Things will change over time. We know that. And so, but right now this is the best sort of storage option, an emergency option. So the other caveat of the inflow equals outflow operation is what we need and what we feel is important for us as a business. These are largely, hydro has a large value, not just as the owner, but to, we've all seen our electricity prices go up. If anyone, wants a great little app to get it's ISO New England's app, you can get on your phone and you can see the anticipated generation, but you can also see the price just going sky high sometimes, particularly this past summer. And so, again, even though it's not technically an emergency, we will oftentimes fill that void of needed energy. Oftentimes that it's spiking up or a unit trips off, price goes up, we see that signal. Now, when we're playing in the day ahead market, we're not anticipating a specific, problem coming on, but there are baseload plants that are, say, nuclear plants. In the old days it was coal, it's gas. Today it's gas and nuclear. They're providing what is the base energy that's going on. There are gas plants that are basically like jet engines. They come on at very quick response rate, and hydro does. And so when we're looking at our inflow, we're not going to be able to take advantage of that kind of responsiveness in an inflow equals outflow, but we've carved out a number of hours to do that. And the hours differ by the month. In June or in May, when there's more spawning and aquatic resource issues to deal with, we have very, very few hours. I think we have 10 hours that we can actually deviate by discretion off inflow equals outflow. Whereas in the winter, where many of the species are dormant, or they're in the mud, or they're less active and less, there's not a spawning component, or we have more hours. And that's essentially how we've sort of mirrored this discretionary flexible operation in terms of reflecting sort of like the resource and the impacts on the river. There's very few hours in the summer, 10 in the spawning period, 20 in the drying period, and there's more hours, more like 60 in the winter, 60 hours in a month. I say these are in a month. These are a month. Yeah. And then unlike today, where we basically can go from a 700 CFS minimum flow unit, for example, here at Wilder, to 10,000 in a minute, or 10 minutes, or 5 minutes, or whatever it might be, rapidly, we do have a ramping up that's associated with this flexible operation, and then a ramping down, and then a refill back to that target. So for every hour, we have an hour ahead and maybe an hour or two behind, and then a couple hours back, and they're all driven by a percentage of that inflow, so that it's not drastic and it's somewhat tailored to be smoother. Now, when you combine all that in and looking at, well, what's this opportunity that I have if I'm in a kind of a lowish sort of flow? Well, 1 hour of higher flow that I may want to, I might like to go if I have a predicted high energy price on an hour, let's just say, and I might want to put my Wilder station at full bore. Well, I got to precede that with a halfway ramping up kind of flow ahead of time, and a couple hours where you're ramping down at 70% or whatever it might be, and then a refill that's at that's a certain volume of water. And if you don't have the water, you're never going to do that at 1 hour. You just can't. You'll never make it up.
So this isn't an algorithm. This is you.
It's going to
see to your pants.
No, I had a model that simulated this, but it is a very good point. We are going to need more of a tool to say, given this situation, do I want to use, and can I use this hour, and how quickly? How long will it? An example would be, hypothetically, the ramp up, the flex hour, the ramp down is all pretty much set on a volume of inflow. But that volume of that inflow is going to drive how long it's going to take you to get back up to your target. And the last thing I kind of want to do is take forever to get back up to that target elevation before I might want to flex again, because then I'm now one step down and I'm buried farther. And so it's that kind of analysis you need to do to figure out, is it even worthwhile to execute this flex, or am I going to get most of what I want by just keeping it on a river during all of that period of time?
So how much is it affected by the amount of solar that's produced around?
Well, that's a price. I mean, that's a demand. That's a price thing. It's really going to be now the the price is largely going to be dependent on supply and demand. So it has a role, and as more solar comes online and is available at that moment when people need it to, in the morning when they flip on their air conditioners in July or whatever, or they come home from work. But it's all going to be, it's all sort of predicted. There's a prediction on what the demand is going to be, and there's a prediction of what the supply is going to be, what we think, and if it's not going to be sunny, the ISO is going to say, we're going to probably get 30% of our solar resources in New England. And that's going to drive what is the predicted curve, price curve, or what we would foresee as being the demand curve for the following day. And we look at that and we'll go, and as an operator, we're going to say, okay, well, we'd like to hit that peak, but if we don't have the water, or if the water's not going to arrive in time, it's going to be different. It's going to be different for those guys that you all met in there. But we're going to need, to your point earlier, we're going to need tools to figure out, can we do this? And it's a model. It's what they call short-term schedule model, an optimizer. But we're also spending, we're going to be spending a lot of effort to better predict hourly inflow than we do today. Yeah.
John, when you say next day market, is it a 24-hour period, and when does it start and when does it stop?
That's a good question. We basically bid in to the next day, which is 24 hours, starting at midnight. So let's just say today's the 1st, we're before 10 o'clock. We will have today's schedule already in until midnight. But at 10 o'clock in the morning, we will schedule from midnight to midnight on tomorrow. And we put that in at 10 o'clock. So we're going to need to have an inflow estimate. And then on a weekend, we may do that 48 hour. We'll put the schedule in. We'll be looking at, or a 3-day weekend.
And there's a cutoff time. Like 10 a.m. is your cutoff.
10 a.m. is when our bids are in.
Right, and then after that, you live with whatever you put in.
After that, the ISO takes everybody's bids and says, and they allocate. Let's just say an example would be, I don't know. When we're looking at our bids, we say we don't have a ton of water. We will, let's just say we have 2 hours, ideally, of a lot of water. And this is in today's world, not in the inflow equals outflow world going forward. But in today's world, we would say we really have enough water to generate 2 hours with 1 unit here versus minimum flow. We're going to try to put those 2 hours in when we make sure when we think the demand is going to be the highest. That's ideally what we would do today. And we can do that at Wilder because we don't have a restriction on a target elevation. We can, an hour of generation or 2 hours of generation here drops the pond maybe 3/10 or 4/10 of a foot or something like that. Maybe a half a foot. I don't, depending on what the inflow is. But we can do that today because we have a certain amount of flexibility, and we know that we can recover it because we have water coming from upstream. And then the rest of the hours we'd have minimum flow. Now, so we would price it that way. We would say, we want to run. So the question is, what's our bid? And it's literally a dollar figure. So if our dollar figure is too high, we think the prices are going to be such that we will get dispatched. We'll put a price in that we think will make that happen. But if the price doesn't actually reach that, we don't get dispatched. And the price doesn't reach that largely because the demand doesn't show up that way. Or the ISO had taken our bids and said, we got a lot of other people that are bidding that at 2 hours cheaper than you. Because they don't schedule us. They don't schedule us. So
when do you find that out?
We find that out generally between, I would say, sometime afternoon, but by 4, usually by 4 that day. And so if you look on our water line or our predicted sites for the next day, it'll say this is our ISO's anticipated schedule for us. Now, they can change that. You know, they can come in at 7 o'clock and go, okay, we goofed on our model and we really need you to go. We're going to reissue the schedule. And they can do that. They can really do that at any time they want, but they don't do it all the time. But they can re-up the schedule. They can revise the schedule. They can revise the schedule if, I don't know, let's just say a plant goes down unexpectedly and they need resources. They will reissue the schedule, especially if they know it in advance of when they.
Can you revise a bit?
And we can, so an example of that would be, a good example of that is, well, we need to move this water. In other words, we don't want to spill it. It's coming at us. Oh, there's a rainstorm or something, you know, we've got water. We've got too much water coming at us. We need to, yes, we can redeclare. There can be a penalty of that. You know, we can, if the real time doesn't actually show up what our day ahead bid was, we actually have to pay that, you know, pay that differential.
Now, the ISOs are, the ones accepting your bids are ISO?
Yeah, it's the independent system operator. They're the ones that are managing the wholesale market.
And they're an independent organization?
They're a quasi-independent organization. Yeah, I mean, it's independent, but it has committees that have a lot of different folks, generators, transmission people that are all sort of like advising the market. But their role is independent, and their number one role is to make sure that the lights are on at the cheapest price.
And they sell that to Liberty and all.
Liberty purchase it.
It's from the ISO.
Do you coordinate?
They don't purchase it. They do the accounting. You know, they're actually purchasing it from us theoretically, but the accounting is all done and it's not like Liberty gets in before Green Mountain Power and gets the price cheaper. They're all paying the same price on the same hour.
Depending on the ISO.
Depending on what the clearing price is.
Do you coordinate your bids with upstream, downstream dams? I mean,
With our dams, yes,
Yeah.
but our dams are all going on one bid,
oh, okay.
essentially. Do we coordinate with First Light downstream? No, that's market manipulation.
No, that's not what I meant.
We do not want
Within
to.
your company.
And we're talking about millions and millions of dollars in fines for those that have been caught doing it. We will not. Yeah.
That makes
No.
sense. I didn't know it went in as one bid for
We
your.
do coordinate when there's high water, or there's public safety, or there's flooding, but we're not coordinating
when it's bid, we're letting them know there's high water
we're more
coming.
coordinating flow.
And
And
they
telling them
yeah,
about
yeah.
what's going on. Yeah.
Plus,
that makes
everybody's
sense.
generating anyway,
That's
because you're spilling.
appreciated.
You're spilling more water than you can generate. We actually lose money when we spill, not because we've lost the water, but the waters, the headwaters come up so far we can't. You know, so it's no. Our key is try to maximize head and generation, but coordination is really with like the Corps and National Weather Service. We're trying to monitor what they predict flows are going to be, and then downstream as well.
When do you think FERC will start looking at your application?
It's a good question. I don't believe First Light is planning to have their settlement completed until the end of the year. So it's they will not issue an RE. Now, we've said we don't see any reason why you couldn't issue an REA for us, at least start the process, because, you know, there's plenty of work to be done. They may not finalize an EIS, so they could do it earlier than that. We don't know. That's up to them, you know, and their resources.
So what are the settlement issues that's holding up First Light?
I don't know.
You don't know. The fisheries and
I mean,
operations has
it's all
been
of that stuff.
resolved.
I believe the scope of their settlement is operation and fish passage and recreation and cultural research. And we didn't do that.
With
I mean,
respect to, you know, the Great River hydros, I mean, obviously operations have pretty well been knocked out. Fish patches have been resolved. Are there any other issues that you're trying to settle now before you're ready for environmental assessment? Okay, and obviously, the issue with First Light and Great River Hydro is because of cumulative impacts under NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, we have to look at cumulative impacts. And so the timing's difficult.
Well, the final, they're not gonna, they're going to do it all at once in the final, but, I mean, there's a lot of work to do, you know what I mean? So I think that, and largely because we're upstream and they're downstream, I mean, we're not, FERC is gonna have them more, and, well, let me just, plus we're proposing run a river, you know, we have a good proposal. We have, this is the first hybrid, I think, in the country that is sort of doing a major peaking operation, changing to run a river with some opportunities for flexible operation. That's a first in the country as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if they're remotely proposing a similar kind of thing. I don't know. Their project is, their most contentious part of their project is the pump storage system. It's not the conventional hydro.
I guess the consensus is not going to get through with just an environmental assessment. It's going to be elevated to an EIS.
It's been identified from day one as
What are the issues that cause it to be an EIS?
complication.
Complication?
Yeah, it's like you got 180 miles of river or 160, 140 some odd miles of river.
I
It's
guess when I've
just,
been involved in these, it's usually because you have, you know, a greater than a minimal impact on a particular issue or resource.
it's more an EA, like we wrote our applications in as if they were EAs. So we've written them as if it's an EA. And I've done that on every relicense. We've sort of, I don't know why they decided but I believe it's because of the scope, the general geographic, and there's two projects and there may be more analysis or I don't know. I would say you can do it. If you didn't have any settlement agreements, I'd say, yeah, it's going to be a little tougher, you know, to sort of figure out the right pathway. In fact, our settlement agreement on our proposed operation is largely a reflection of, you know, we did whatever, $8 million worth of aquatic resource studies, gave it to the agencies, and they look at it and go like, we can't make any heads or tails out of this. I mean, no, in terms of finding like the true pathway. So we both sort of came to the conclusion, how about we not try to find some kind of mathematical pathway through all of these studies and say, why don't we try to get it closer to a more naturalized system? Now, there's still going to be flow changes that come in from upstream, and we know that. And in fact, there's flow changes that come in, but it's much more of a naturalized, instead of having the 700 minimum flow, we have no minimum flow in our proposal. It's run a river. So it's going to be higher. And that is sort of like it's a monumental step in the right direction compared to a standard. I don't know if that's what First Light's doing. My sense is they're not there yet.
The EIS is going to have to incorporate both First Light and Great River Hydro, right?
What's that?
The EIS is going to take into consideration what First Light and Great River Hydro is going to be doing. Who basically does the study for the EIS?
Who does it? It could be an outside consultant, but it's FERC.
Has it not been chosen? I mean, obviously, according to FERC's criteria, right? But usually a consultant, and so.
Well, I don't know if that's what they're going to do. FERC has a consulting team. It's usually one or two large vendors that provide third-party consultation. I don't know if they're going to do that in this case. I don't know.
They haven't even initiated that process or even decided who's going to do
they
it.
have consultants on board. They're working on other projects, you know, throughout the country.
So FERC hires consultants on a regular basis, not just for a particular project, but they always have the
Like
consultant.
Louis Berger, or in this case, it's.
And they go for like a
it's-
three-year term. So
But the bottom line is,
it's-
nobody's been sort of contracted to start the EIS on these projects, or we call it this project, at this point in time.
I can't speak for FERC, Jim. I don't know. I do know that.
They have, we don't know.
No.
They've decided on somebody, we don't know.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I mean, I did know, 2 years ago that WSP, which is a large consulting company, they were formerly Berger, who has done FERC contract work for 25 years. They have a whole wing that basically, they're like FERC guys, but they work, they're an outside party. I know WSP was targeted to do these projects. but I don't know if they are today because they're not doing anything.
I guess one last
They were
question.
involved. They were involved early on when they were looking at the applications of ours and First Light's and trying to identify, are the applications complete? I know that they engaged, not only FERC staff but third-party folks to do that evaluation of the application. But there's nothing to say that they're going to do the EIS. They just used them as a contractor to say, look at the applications and see if they're deemed correct.
One final question. I feel like I've been,
No, that's fine.
And I want to thank you, John, for coming in and giving us an update on what's going on. But, clearly, I think one of the most important issues to most of the stakeholders along the river here is the potential for erosion and whether there'll be some kind of a mitigation enhancement fund. And it seems to me that the sooner we can get started on discussing this, that the quicker we can get this whole process to come to an end. And these agreement, if we can come to one, could be incorporated into the EIS as a compensatory mitigation for what we call the unavoidable impacts from the operation of the facilities. I mean, to your knowledge, or maybe that's above your pay grade or something, but is there any initiative?
But go ahead.
Is there any attempt to try to get discussions going with the stakeholders along the river in terms of mitigation enhancement fund? That was done on, as you know, on previous hydro facility relicensing.
So one, it is not the most important issue for stakeholders. We already we hear that loud and clear. The most important issue for stakeholders was our peaking operation. Was peaking operations. Effects on aquatic biota, aquatic habitat. That was the number one, clearly by a land. Not like embellishing here. There were folks that are interested in erosion. I grant you that. But in terms of the sheer volume of studies that we did, spent, paid for, evaluated, had back and forth on, it was aquatic resources and operations. It wasn't fish passage, and it certainly wasn't erosion, and it certainly wasn't recreation. So I would differ. My opinion differs from yours, number one. Number two, a lot of folks that are concerned about erosion felt it was our operations that were causing it. We did plenty of studies that we believe clearly shows that that is not the case. Erosion is a natural process largely affected in this river by high water, not operation flows, and certainly not the fluctuation that people say they saw. But given all that, our proposal for operating largely in a run-of-river, stable impoundment, and largely passing the flow through that it comes, instead of turning the river on and off from high to low every day, is in line with the kinds of concerns they had about our operation. So indirectly, we believe we've addressed the concerns about our operation that they, stakeholders, would say is the cause of erosion. We don't actually believe that that's the cause of erosion, the major cause of erosion, or the erosion cycle in this entire river system. But to the extent that our operations, in their opinions, or in folks' opinions, cause that, we think we've largely mitigated that by the new operating protocol. So that's how we are essentially feeling we've addressed those concerns, number one. Regarding an enhancement and mitigation fund, you referenced other projects. We are not proposing an enhancement or mitigation fund, period. There are elements that we've suggested would be like that. For example, as part of our historic and cultural resource plan, we've suggested, because we had a really hard time assembling sort of a documentation of traditional practices and properties from tribal interests. We tried to engage them. There's a lot of sort of infighting, a lot of different opinions, a lot of don't talk to them, talk to us kind of stuff. And so we actually don't think there's a lot out there that we can sort of like capture and document. Rather, we're going to provide a fairly modest, but a significant pool of money that will help them if they want to have educational, if they want to have programs, utilize some of our facilities. They can decide what they want to do as a way of developing sort of a knowledge about traditional properties, because it's not easy to capture, and we acknowledge we weren't able to capture it. We tried, but this is a better way as to if there are traditional properties or practices that they would like to pull together. This is a way of doing it. So there's a small element there. Other than that, we think our proposed operation and fish passage mitigation, which is somewhere in the vicinity of $28 million, is a very significant investment. And an enhancement and mitigation fund is not appropriate. We're spending a lot of money on operations and fish passage. And I think we've addressed some of those issues that indirectly that folks have had relative to how our operations may be affected.
Yeah. I mean, I see the arbitrator of this really is going to be the consultant firm that's hired to do the EIS. They're going to look at the.
Don't distinguish between the consulting firm and.
Well, I mean, they're an independent private organization under contract to follow NEPA guidelines.
It is the commission that decides. It is not a third party or a consulting firm.
And so basically it's going to be them sort of like determining whether or not there is a potential for an adverse effect on cultural resources or erosion from the data you guys have submitted based upon your studies and the previous negotiations. It's not really for Great River Hydro to draw that conclusion.
Well, we've provided the information in our studies. We've provided the information in our studies, and they have in front of them basically, or will have, proposals for 5 projects as to how they want to operate in the future. It is up to them to evaluate whether or not there's an adequate balance between power and non-power resources in these proposals. That's their charge. Is it an appropriate balance between those two sort of sides of the equation? That's what they do. And they do it in the context of NEPA. That's what they do.
We're getting close to our time for our meeting, but I think we can go with a few more questions.
Sure, and I'll touch on the last of a few little processes so that there is still opportunity for public comment and things like that. So I want to make sure you know that. But go ahead, yeah.
The status on recreation for Wilder, Bellows Falls and Vernon.
So in our amendment, we've largely, I think it's around, I can't remember exactly what the number is, but there's a figure that basically we are enhancing all of our recreation facilities. We're going through them all. There'll be a new design. Some of them will be maybe very new designs, like say a portage or something like that. But there's nothing brand new getting developed, with the exception of we're bringing into the project the canoe campsites that are not in our project license now. We still manage the number of them, we fund them, but they're not in the project as a project facility because they weren't around when the last project. But those will become part of the new license. So that's largely, and one would say, geez, is that all you're doing? It's actually quite a bit that we're doing, number one, but we don't actually have a lot of land. FERC is not going to, they're not going to say, you need to do this on somebody's private land. It's out of their jurisdiction. They don't do that. They can't do that. They're not going to say you should have, a $5 million recreation enhancement fund to affect recreation outside your project boundary, outside of the land you own. They're just not going to do that. It'd be the same thing for an enhancement. Our enhancement fund that we have had established back in the early 2000s for 15 Mile Falls. There isn't one thing that FERC regulates with that enhancement. It's out of the project. It was part of a settlement that was done at the time. But it is not part of the project, not project mitigation, and it hasn't been. That answer your question? Yeah. Go ahead.
So there were no aquatic species, and nobody cared, no erosion, no anything else. And it was just to maximize profit.
Sure.
How different would your proposal look?
We would still be a peaker.
Right, so,
Yeah.
so you're going.
We would defend our minimum flow as being adequate, even though it was 1970s vintage, you know.
Right, you just let it go.
Yes. Well, we would we
Fill it up and run it out. Right?
No, well, run it out. I mean, people don't understand. We don't make in water. We only generate with what we get. And you know, we have large peaking plants upstream up at 50 Mile Falls, and they ran minimum flow for 68 days straight. We didn't generate anything except minimum flow, and that's fine. But that's because that's all the water there is. We can't make it. We're not making it. If we could make it, it'd be one thing. But
So your proposal is a realistic look based on up and downstream and what you have to, what's available.
Our proposed operation is largely inclined to improve and create a more naturalized flow. It's not a natural river. It hasn't been for 150 years. But the flows aren't going to be 700 and 10,000. They're going to be largely around 2,000 or 3,000 around the clock.
And you don't store any electricity. Whatever you make goes out.
Well, we have. I mean, I would say our storage reservoirs are potential energy. You know, so there's storage in a way. But when to your point you made earlier, I mean, ideally, in the perfect world, if we could make water, we would have endless amounts of water. But we have a short-term forecast of what flow is going to be, but we also have long-term. We have sort of like these annual curves that say, you know, we typically don't get a lot of water in August. We often get October rains. We don't get any runoff to speak of in the middle of winter because it's frozen. I mean, we have historic patterns that we guide us in a long-term sense. And so if we were to use all our water on a particular day and we don't have any water on the next day, and the next day the demand is higher, we've screwed ourselves. So we have long-term sort of guidance, and because every drop that you can't replenish that you use is not available for another opportunity. So you just, it's not willy-nilly. It's very carefully planned, and I would say that to the benefit of the river, you know, we often were asked this question. I think Sharon Francis asked it every time I saw her. Like, how is your operation going to take into account global warming? And I would say, well, if I knew exactly what global warming was going to do here, I could answer you, but I don't know. But I do know that we have experienced definitely one of the 2 months, May or June, which typically neither is very dry these days. One of them. And it's a weird kind of phenomenon, and it's just data that I'm kind of referring to. But statistically, one of those 2 months is very dry. We often have a 25 or 20 to 30 day period of real dry condition. We didn't used to see that. I don't know why, but we don't. And the other thing we get is very high precip coming out of a storm, much higher. I mean, we've seen some discharge coming out of the Passumpsic with some storms that would just go off the chart compared to what we used to see. And so if I really was answered her, you know, truthfully, I'd go like, we'd build bigger dams so we could capture that. But we're not going to. That's senseless. So, you know, again, it's about getting a better handle on inflow predictions. I think will have a benefit to everybody, and it'll allow us to continue to have a smoother flow that's predicted a day in advance or a couple of days in advance, and that's a benefit. It's not going to be easy. I mean, we are looking at a couple of very, very smart services that are trying to predict inflow on an hourly basis, and we have we've engaged the Pacific National Labs to help evaluate those systems to see if they can benefit us on this river before we have to rely on them, basically. Yeah. Real quickly, we have 401 applications that need to go into both states. There are public, usually it's either a public meeting. It depends on which state. In Massachusetts, they don't even do that, which is bizarre. But in Vermont, there's usually a sort of public comment period that may be on the draft, maybe on at the front end, like a scoping kind of meeting. I don't know, but both of these agreements, the fish passage and the operations, are essentially the agent's position going into those 401 as a sort of a proposed operation. Those are going to be included in that. I can't say that that's what will come out of the far end, but there are 401 now, and 401s will be, once our applications are largely full and accepted, kind of thing. There's a 1-year time clock for those states. And FERC needs to have the 401 issued before they can issue their final EIS or their license. We do have, largely it's related to dwarf wedge mussel that is in river kind of species. We have elements in our proposed operations that are intended to address some of the more critical times and locations for some of those species, particularly below Wilder but above Bellows. We have some dwarf wedge mussel specific kind of operating protocols, but we will have to do a formal consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service on that. We don't foresee them to be terribly challenging because we largely were addressing them when we were dealing and pulling together, but there is a sort of independent formal consultation process. And then the same thing with historic and cultural resources. We have a programmatic agreement that needs to be signed between ourselves and the states and the feds, FERC, as well as potentially the advisory council. We're going to invite tribal leaders to comment on it. They may be a concurring signatory to those documents, but they're not required to, but we are going to engage them. And that's really that's the sort of workload and the lift that we have in front of us, besides all the FERC stuff.
Bill?
That's it.
Any timetable for completion of this?
Well, again, I mean, I'm, it's not a hard number or anything, but if FERC is going to wait until first light, and then let's just say first light wouldn't even put in their 401 applications if in fact if we don't before then, or we don't until then either. It's usually a year that the states will have with their 401. In this case, because we got 3 states going on here, one of them is probably going to take the full year, if not all 3 of them. So it's a year probably out from, say, the first part of the year that that FERC will even be ready to issue a draft license. I would think. So I don't foresee a license occurring for a 1.5 to 2 years from now. That's just a rough.
So this has been going on, what, for 10, 11 years already? So,
And
that
it's
does
been
seem like
going
a
on
compressed
since
time
2012 officially, yeah. But I mean, that's 6, yeah, I mean, it's longer than but nobody would ever have told me this wasn't going to be this. I mean, I think it's a couple of years. Vermont Yankee shutting down kind of delayed things a year or so in terms of studies, and there's a few reasons why, but.
And there are 2 comment periods within that time frame. It's public comment within that time frame. So there's still an opportunity for public comment on what we're proposing.
There'll be a draft EIS and a draft, essentially it'll kind of be like a draft license, but it's largely it'll be driven by this is our recommendation at FERC for what the new license should look like, and that will be a major comment period for that. And then the same thing would probably be for the 401s. This is what our draft 401 looks like. Even though, again, in Massachusetts, they issue a draft, but they don't actually allow comment. So it's but that'll be affecting sort of the first light stuff. But that's largely it. I mean, our website is still open, and the applications are in there. And as things change, we are hoping that things are moving forward, but it is what it is. I mean, it's not, people often say like this, it's like you're not in any rush. This is how you get paid. And I go like, I'm really ready for this to be over, but it isn't. I mean, after 40 years, I'm really, you know what I'm saying? I'm really ready for this to be over. And give it to Jen to figure out how to do it.
You gotta work on those boxes, you still got some more to go through,
I
right?
do. I have one more left.
There's nothing classified in those.
There are. I actually have to shred a lot of stuff. There's definitely a lot of, things like, I would have 5 copies of some cultural resource study that shows all the locations of, artifacts. And, okay, you gotta, more like, locations on a map, pinpointing Latin long. You don't want that.
Send them off to the archives.
No, I'm shredding them.
Just shred them.
Makes
Scan and
sense.
shred.
Protected. They are protected.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was
Yeah, it
great.
was helpful. Hopefully.
Really helpful.
Very nice, John, yeah.
And good luck. I'm glad to see you're in good hands with
John.
with Jennifer.
That's right.
Right.
And if you have any questions or anything, don't hesitate. I know we actually are. There are some comments that went in on our fish passage agreement. Those got filed literally right before I walked in the door. So you will see some of our responses to some of the comments about the fish passage settlement agreement. Hopefully, we'll address people's concerns, or at least it'll answer them. Go from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John.
Yeah.